Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Fun with Pipettes. Now today's episode is about performing dilutions, which is an important part of laboratory work. And there are a couple of things to point out. If you haven't already seen our video, make sure you have a look at our video on how to use pipettes properly. And secondly, before you perform any dilutions, make sure whether it's tubes or Eppendorf tubes that they are correctly labelled and so you know what you are pipetting into. And we're now going to show you a number of examples of different types of dilutions. In this example we're going to look at a non-serial dilution, and this is a way to set up 4 different tubes with 4 different concentrations. Now, the first thing to recognise is the stock concentration, which is 100 grams per milliliter. And we're diluting with water. You should check carefully in your practical handbook or scheme of work as to what you are diluting with. Our total volume required is 10 millilitres. So if we look at our 4 examples, we'll start with tube 4 because that's the simplest. It's 100 grams per milliliter, which is the same as the stock concentration. And so to get a volume of 10, it's simply 10 milliliters of stock solution and 0 milliliters of water, because we're not diluting. But in tube 3, this is our first dilution. It's 75 grams per milliliter, which is obviously less than 100. So this time it's 7.5 of stock solution and 2.5 milliliters of water. Again, total volume of 10. So the 50 is half of the 100, so half the volume, or 5 mils of stock, and then 5 mils of water. Last but not least is our 25 grams per milliliter tube, in which we have 2.5 milliliters of stock and 7.5 milliliters of water, and you'll notice all the tubes add up to a total volume of 10 milliliters. And now for a practical demonstration of our non-fold serial dilution. We have the tubes 1 to 4. The water has already been added as specified on the board shown just before, and so we're going to add the stock solution. So tube 1 has 2.5 milliliters of the stock. Now the next tube requires 5, and so we change the dial until we get to 5 milliliters. We're not going to change the tip at this stage because we're not touching any of the water, and we're using the same stock. That's 5 mils there. We now change to 7.5 for tube 3. And then lastly, 10 milliliters for our final tube. Remembering to do all of this slowly and release the solution slowly as well. And that means our dilutions are now fully prepared. The next example is a 2-fold serial dilution. Serial dilutions are a convenient way to get a consistent dilution range to give us a range of concentrations. The name serial means that we're diluting from one tube to the next and so on in a series of dilutions to give us a series of different concentrations. In this example, we have a stock solution of 100 grams per milliliter. The diluent is, again, water. The total volume required is 10 millilitres, and we want to have 4 tubes of different dilutions. But what you'll notice is that tube 1 is a twofold dilution of the stock, so from 100 to 50, and then tube 2 is half again, 25, and then from tube 2 to 3, from 25 to 12.5, again twofold dilution, and then again 6.25. Now if we look at the next page, this explains the procedure to do this. Now for a serial dilution, you would set up your 4 tubes with the diluent ready, the water, so it's the same volume of water each time, and then we do our serial dilution. So we transfer 10 millilitres of stock into tube 1, and that means we've added the same volume of stock to the same volume of water, so that's a twofold dilution, or sometimes called a 1 in 2 dilution. We allow the solution to mix, and then this is where the series of dilutions happen. 10 millilitres transferred from tube 1 to tube 2, allowed to mix. 10 millilitres then taken from tubes 2 to 3, again allowed to mix, and then 10 millilitres taken from tube 3 to tube 4. Now because tube 4 is the last tube in the series, it will have double the volume, and so if your tubes need to be 10 millilitres in total, then you would remove 10 millilitres from this tube and discard, and you would then have 10 millilitres in each tube at the serial dilution required. For the purposes of this example, we're using quite large volumes. For your twofold serial dilution, it's possible and quite likely that you'll be using a much smaller volume. It's important that we change tips between each tube, as the concentration will change and we don't want any cross-contamination. So the first step is to take 10 millilitres of stock solution, and this is put into tube 1 as specified on the board. And we allow the solution to mix, and we discard our pipette tip. We then take 10 millilitres from tube 1 into tube 2, so this is beginning our series of dilutions, and you can see the colour is changing here. We discard that pipette tip again, and then 10 millilitres from tube 2 to tube 3. Remember, it's the same volume each time because it's a serial dilution, and we're diluting by a factor of 2 each time. Discard the tip, and then for the final step, 10 millilitres from tube 3 to tube 4. And if your final volume required should be the same each time, then we remove 10 from here. So we have the same volume in each tube, and we discard. This has now led to a range of dilutions, which you can see with the colour change there. Now in this example, we're doing a 10-fold serial dilution. And again, as with the 2-fold serial dilution, it's about having a series of tubes through which we dilute to get a range of concentrations, but this time it's 10-fold. So this gives us a larger concentration range because it's a 10-fold dilution. Again, our stock is 100 grams per milliliter. Diluent is water. Total volume required is 9 millilitres in this example. We're going to have 4 tubes and we have a range of concentrations. Tube 1 is a 10-fold dilution of the stock of 100, and then tube 2 is a 10-fold dilution of this one, so from 10 to 1. And then the next one, 10-fold from 1 to 0.1 grams per millilitre, and finally, in the last tube, 0.01 grams per millilitre. So if we go to the next page and show you how this would be done, we set up our 4 tubes with the same volume of water, which we're going to use to dilute. Now we're going to do our 10-fold dilution. We transfer 1 millilitre from the stock solution into the first tube. This is our first 1 in 10 or 10-fold dilution. A common mistake here is to think that you need to have 10 mils of water and add 1 mil of stock, but remember it's a 1 in 10. This is now a total volume of 10. This is the first dilution. We then transfer 1 millilitre from this tube into the next tube. That's the next dilution. Allow the solution to mix. Transfer 1 millilitre from the second tube to the third tube. That's our next 10-fold dilution. Allow to mix, and then finally to the last tube. Remember that if your tubes need to be 9 millilitres in volume, you will need to discard the extra milliliter in this tube and discard it into waste. So for our 10-fold serial dilution, we're going to transfer 1 ml from the stock solution into tube 1. And the pipette is set up to 1000 microlitres, which is 1 milliliter. We transfer to tube 1. We allow the solutions to mix, and we discard this pipette tip and choose a second pipette tip. It's important to change pipette tips between dilutions, and then it's the same volume, 1 milliliter from tube 1 to tube 2, and allow to mix. Change our pipette tip. And you'll see that the colour is changing. 1 milliliter from tube 2 into tube 3. Because it's a 10-fold dilution, the change in colour is more noticeable than in the 2-fold dilution, because there's a larger change in concentration. And lastly, from tube 3 to tube 4, and then if we require the same volume in each tube, it means removing that extra 1 ml from tube 4 and discarding. And that's the end of our 10-fold serial dilution. Thank you for watching this episode of Fun with Pipettes. I hope you've had as much fun as I have. And if you're interested in more, if you have any questions, then you can see my Twitter feed on the top of the board. So feel free to follow me on Twitter, and thanks for watching.